Welcome everyone to the last session of this set of sessions, I guess. I think we'll have at least one or two follow-up ones sometime forthcoming to be announced. But I'm very happy to be here again with you all. And do we have anyone new? Okay, yes, Vanessa and, well, of course, Christina. So maybe we can do the abbreviated introduction round, maybe just who you are and your institutional affiliation. So maybe we can start and then just tag the next person. So I'll start. I'm Sharon, and I work at UBC, University of British Columbia, and I will tag Christina.
Hi, my name is Christina Yao, and I'm at the University of South Carolina, and I will go with Dale.
I'm Dale. I'm a grad student at UBC for about another 35 days or so. Thanks. And I'll tag Kumari.
Oh, do unmute myself. Kumari back from Simon Fraser, and yeah.
You want to tag someone, Kumari?
Tag Max.
I'm Max Crummy-Effender. I'm a PhD candidate at Loyola University Chicago. I'll tag Gian.
I'm Gian Hernandez. I'm a PhD student based at Università della Svizzera Italiana in Switzerland, but being graciously hosted by Sharon at UBC in Vancouver. And I will tag Gerardo.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gerardo Blanco. In 3 more days, I'll be joining Boston College, and I want to tag Tatiana.
Hi, my name is Tatiana Suspitsina. I'm at The Ohio State University, and I'm going to tag Stuart.
Hi, I'm Stuart. I'm in London at UCL Institute of Education, and I will tag Andre.
Hi, Andre Nelson, Mandela University, South Africa. I'll tag Blanca.
Hi everyone, Blanca Torres Olavet from Loyola University Chicago. I'll tag Karen.
Karen, is your mic not working? Well, we lost Karen a bit.
Her mic is muted.
Looks like she's also freezing a bit.
Yes, she is. Hi, Karen.
Okay, well, Karen, we'll wait for you. Hopefully you could come back. Who hasn't been? Sarah.
Sorry, I'm on a 5-minute lag. We're introducing ourselves, yes?
Just the brief one.
I'm Sarah, and I am calling in from England.
Do you want to tag someone? Or did you come in late so you don't know who's gone?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Vanessa, do you want to go?
I'm Vanessa, calling from the Muscom Reserve near the University of British Columbia.
And then I think Amy, have you?
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm at UBC in Vancouver, and I'll tag Rupa.
Hi, Rupa here from York University, Toronto.
Great. I think, did I miss anyone? No. Okay, great.
Sue hasn't.
Sue, I'm sorry. Sue did.
No, it's fine. I'm Sue. I'm in Ireland.
Okay. So this session, I think the presenters have a plan for how they want to run it. So I'm going to pass the mic to them now.
Okay. So the presenters are myself, Kumari, and Christina, as you well know. And I think what we wanted to do for this panel is to kind of give a little bit of context as to what drew us to this particular area of research, and then also kind of show where we'd like the conversation to go in terms of how we shape it. For me, I think it's important to kind of to acknowledge the sort of positionality that we all have, and that definitely informs where I was going when I initially sought out this topic. So I'm a person of color who has attended 6 different universities outside of the country in which I was born. And so this idea of race and the translation of race in various contexts is like an overarching force in terms of what I'm doing. And I'm also of the opinion that research is, at least to some extent, always autobiographical. So this kind of idea definitely pushes the theoretical inquiry that I have behind my work. When we met a number of times throughout the last couple of weeks, and we wanted to talk about, you know, how we see this research going forward. And that is, I think, something that I'd like to kind of offer to the group as what we're talking about when we talk about race and internationalization. For me specifically, like, I'm interested in, as you might have heard in my presentation, this decentering of the nation and nationality. It might be a bit of a naive or banal observation, but the idea of internationalization being intrinsically based on the nation state is something that I feel is often overlooked, especially when we talk about the attendant colonial violences, when we think of conceptualizing a nation. So for my contribution, I want to ask questions of, if we push back on this idea, if we push back on the idea of nation and nation state as being an overarching force, where does that lead us? And kind of when I talk about my research, I'm interested in the narratives that kind of go into how we invest or disinvest in terms of capital, in terms of affect, in terms of the psychic sort of burden of thinking through internationality, and what kind of narratives are liberatory. So like, how do we move forward in terms of a very praxis-oriented approach to internationalization? And then kind of to close up, I want to think about what kind of material and embodied conditions are necessary for this liberation, because often when we think of internationalization, and I've noticed throughout the conversations, we've been gesturing towards affect and gesturing towards embodiment and gesturing towards kind of our own sort of situated positionalities, but I really want to think about that explicitly and kind of bring that up when we talk about specifically race and internationalization. And so I think these are the things that are driving me, and I'm hoping that in the conversations that follow, we can definitely center those concerns. So I think I'll just stop there and offer the floor to Christina.
Yes, hi. Hello from South Carolina. So my research is really centered on the experiences of international students and international student mobility to the US. More broadly speaking, it's all very rooted in my positionality as an Asian American woman in the US, who's the daughter of immigrants. And my mom was actually an international student from Hong Kong way back in the day. I think she came here in 1968, I think. I actually have a picture from the night before she left to come to the US and everything. And so growing up, I heard a lot about her experiences coming here, a lot about how, about language, issues of, even back in the day, she couldn't find soy sauce in the grocery store and everything like that. But a lot about some of the discriminatory experiences that she also had as somebody who came here as an international student and then became a naturalized citizen. And so a lot of her experiences, what I found was that were very relevant to today. Not a lot has changed. And so what I really think a lot about is how does the context affect some of the experiences that international students have here in the US, especially when you think about the fact that the US is a settler colonial nation that is rooted in imperialism, racism, very xenophobic, as we've seen with a lot of the recent stuff that's happening. And so in thinking about international students coming to the US, how do they navigate these contexts? And then also more broadly, how do they become racialized or to a certain extent re-racialized within the US context? Some of the major highlights from my video would be considerations that student mobility contributes to the soft power of the United States. International students tend to be viewed as commodities. And then most recently, as we are all in the midst of COVID-19, is thinking about how international students, especially those from Asia, are simultaneously viewed as cash cows, right, as economic resources for institutions institutions of higher education, and yet also are being viewed as carriers of the yellow peril, right? Which again is very much rooted in the socio-historical foundations of the US and everything. And so my question now, as we're moving forward, is thinking about, well, how do we, so now what? We know that international students are being racialized beings in the US, and especially coming to light now in the time of COVID. What are the implications of that? And then also, we also know that many times international students tend to fulfill a role in institutions of higher education as being sources of diversity, right? When institutions put the numbers together, like, oh, look how diverse our students are. But really, that's a combination of both domestic and international students. And so especially right now, with all the current stuff that's happening in the US related to racial justice or racial injustice, what are the implications of how international students are viewed and how international students are and likely will remain as commodities as we keep moving forward? So I'm going to pass it on to Kumari.
Thanks, Christina and Jian. So one of the highlights for me, of course, in following the great disappointment of not being able to meet with all of you face to face, was having these really in-depth discussions with Jian and Christina. And this whole project for me in venturing out into writing and presenting about race is a very deeply personal one. I have not researched this before in terms of my scholarship, and I wondered why. And so it was a time to reflect on that in terms of why it was that something that I live with on a daily basis, and I teach anti-racism education in a very white institution. I'm in a biracial family, and having seen my kids, going through a very deeply racialized school experience, and I wondered about my own reluctance of going into researching what my data on the experiences of both of faculty, students, and staff is just overflowing with examples and findings on racialization. And then I came to this, to this realization that at least I wanted very selfishly to sort of, it was an act of self-preservation, that I perhaps didn't want to go deeply into something that affects the students I work with, some of the colleagues I work with, my Indigenous colleagues and Indigenous students, and how pervasive it is. So I came to this presentation from that position, and of course deeply enraged and saddened by the events, as you know, from what I put out. So I wanted this to be a little, I came to this from a different place than being more of a personal exploration than scholarly academic one. And so with Jian's work, I very much resonated with Jian, your the innovation and creativity in terms of the focus on affect, and in particular with the difficult embodiment piece in terms of how a lot of my international students, and the data comes about how people feel always international, always foreign. And that was something that I want to investigate more in greater complexity. And with Christina's work, I sort of also reflected on the deeply racist relationship we've had with people of Chinese ancestry, of the exploitive nature of people from China who actually connected east to west with working on the railways, and their exclusion from social life. So from yellow peril to the commodification of international students from China and South and East Asia, and back again to Christina's work on back again to yellow peril, right? And so there was a great a connection there, as well as our common interest in interest convergence and critical race theory, in seeing that this is not some aberration, that this is an everyday reality and everyday lived experience. And so moving forward, I'm very much engaged with the erasure of race from internationalization. And from that erasure, what are the how can we talk back to internationalization itself in terms of in our critical internationalization studies as a counter narrative that critical race theory presents us with, the framework of counter narrative. And so I want to explore with all of you in terms of those possibilities.
So do the presenters have a preference about how we move forward from here? Would you
No,
want?
it's just, yeah, as before.
Okay.
Let's see what comes up for people.
Okay, so as before then, if you have a question or response, go ahead and say it.
I have a kind of response question. Can you hear me? Yes. Yay! So sorry, I was totally frozen and I'm trying to say, I'm frozen from being frozen. It's like, anyways, some sort of new pseudo reality we're all facing. However, my question is around, not exactly sure how to frame it because I acknowledge that race is something I need to be theorizing more explicitly in my own work and my own positionality. What I'm thinking about, though, is the intersections of the 3 different papers and the difficulties we're facing. Exactly, I'm just thinking my own personal experience right now trying to support Black colleagues and taking up our institution's really horribly pedantic, superficial response to Black Lives Matters, and then having conversations with some of our international students who come from China. The ones I've been talking to anyways come from China, Singapore, and their experiences of Black Lives Matter. And so, you know, racialization happens in different ways in different contexts. And I'm also thinking about some work Lynette Schultz has been doing at University of Alberta around racism of immigrant communities against Indigenous communities, and kind of they've been doing some really interesting work connecting up refugee communities with Indigenous elders and things like this. So I was just thinking around these kind of tensions and how impossible it is to talk about all of them in any piece of work. But because, you know, at the end of the day, you gotta kind of decide on your slice. But I was just interested to hear a conversation about that if anyone wanted to pick it up.
Vanessa, do you want to?
Yeah, I was also involved in conversations about that with BIPOC people here in my university at UBC, and how it's really difficult to talk about. It's like being between a rock and a hard place, because every critique that we have of our own BIPOC strategies can be very easily weaponized by the other side, right? And with terrible consequences. So the difficulty of raising the contradictions and the paradoxes of, for example, having BIPOC people super invested in the system and not interested in changing things for other BIPOC people as well. People getting into leadership positions and then forgetting. And then also how certain BIPOC people too they have had their sensibilities forged by privilege or aspirations for privilege, and then they may not have access to other sensibilities that do not aspire for the same thing. So how do we talk about that even? How do we raise the issue, including the issue of sometimes minority communities being racist against Indigenous people without it being weaponized by other people to reproduce violence against everybody else? And yeah, I've been thinking about that too, Karen. Thank you for raising it and putting it on the table.
So I think one of the pieces here, and I really value the difficulty of these conversations, right? And I think something that I have been grappling with is just, it's important to recognize how we can't have all of the conversations at the same time without committing an injustice to each of these groups. right? So yes, from an analytical perspective, an overview makes sense, and all of these forms of oppression are interconnected. But at the same time, I really believe, right, that the racial incidents that international students of Asian descent that they're experiencing on our campuses, that deserves its own space, right? And also, I think the conversation about Black Lives Matter deserves its own space, right? So while we want to build that solidarity, I also think it's important that we make that space for each of these conversations. Otherwise, we may be complicit just in adding, right, like more to the injustice, right? Because it, like, what's really at the core of these movements is this notion of not being seen and not being heard, right? So I would never want to contribute to that, right? And then that means, and this is the challenge, that when we want to support these movements, we probably will have to be doing things multiple times and working more at it, right? And that kind of runs counter to this idea of efficiency that we all are so well trained about, right? So I just kind of wanted to share that with the group, and maybe just wondering if there is any group wisdom, right, to say, how do we do all of these, right, without also being completely burnt out, so that we can actually be present in these actions? Because I just feel it in my body, right? Like the pressure of wanting to do all of it, and also recognizing that we can't, right? That nobody can, but feeling also very self-conscious. And this is the other piece, right? Feeling a lot of judgment about what we are supposed to be doing, right? Which goes often far beyond what we can be doing at any given time.
I would also throw in, I think that I think in response to all the stuff that's happening right now is that there's a very intellectual, very academic response that I think all of us can give, right? Like, this is the reason, this is why, this is how, and we know it, we read about it, we can talk about it. And then there's that very, very personal piece. You know, even Gerardo, you saying like, I really feel this. Yes, I've been feeling this for, you know, several weeks. I mean, yeah, and plus we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So there's a lot of different things. And I think that you know, when we think about race and race, and I think a lot of people also have very different definitions and opinions about what race is, right? Race is very contextual. Race may not be you know, some may say it's very socially constructed, but there's very real ramifications from it, all of that stuff. But when we think about, you know, if you think about the experiences of, say, for example, Asian international students, you know, the discrimination they're experiencing in the time of COVID, right? We're talking about Black lives, you know, needing to matter because they haven't been mattering and everything. So when you think about it, it's all really rooted in the foundations of whiteness, right? And even from a personal perspective, sometimes I'm like, like when I start talking about these things with people, I'm always get a little nervous because, you know, my white friends and colleagues and family members sometimes think like I'm being anti-white people, and that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about that concept of whiteness, of like, you know, whiteness is the foundation of everything that we do, and everything that's you know, if you even think about, I'll just use the U.S. as an example, right? The context of the U.S., right, is really founded in whiteness. When you think about with the indigenous communities, you think about, you know, the transatlantic slave trade. When you think about, you know, internment camps with Japanese Americans and everything. And so I think that's where, to a certain extent, when we think about what are the commonalities when we talk about, you know, the experiences of discrimination and racism and all of that in these different populations, is that it can't be where like, well, I experienced this, and this is more important, and this is, it's all important. Sometimes it might be more salient at different times, depending on what's happening. But the foundation is really that, look, you know, these are some systemic issues that we have, and that it is rooted in whiteness, and that's what it affects, you know, all these multiple populations and everything. And that affects, you know, and again, not even just in the US, thinking about the global flows of things and stuff, right? Of thinking about what is colorism. You know, thinking about even in Asia, right? Colorism, right? That like having lighter skin is better. I grew up with my family always telling my parents, my grandparents, don't go out in the sun, right? It's better to have very white skin. Well, where does that come from? You know, things like that too. So anyway, just a few thoughts that I had.
If I can, oh, go ahead, Kumari.
No, I'll wait.
Thank you so much, everyone, for you know, what you're prompting and what you've prompted in your presentations. I really appreciate the conversation about embodiment, and also how we, like, this system does not allow for escape from the process of racialization. And I think, and here I'm coming as an international student, and then international scholar, now immigrant, all these slashes that keep accumulating that I feel like I did not choose, but at the same time they hold, because they're relational, they hold special meanings for me, like in relation to my students.
You're muted, Blanca.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, something happened. But I was saying, you know, that I can't escape these categories that keep accumulating, but at the same time, how they start meaning something else as I relate to my students, to colleagues, to people around me, having a community here. And one of the things that, for me, you know, that came from listening to you has been this, what is my role as someone who was like, and I'm based in the US right now, right? With and learning every day about the context of racialization and dominance and violence, systemic violence, and how I didn't grow up with that, and how I feel the need to perform a certain kind of Mexicanness for my students to support them, and people of colorness, that I've been embedded in that since being in the US and in Canada. But you know, that gut feeling of having been raised with it, I don't have. And so something that I grapple a lot with is, what is my role in, I won't say healing because that's not up to me, but in easing some of the suffering. Like, one of my Black queer students, you know, came up to me. This was the weekend before the protest started here in Chicago, and he was completely desolate, burnt out. You know, he's a lot of our students are involved in activism. And so we were going to have a discussion about TAing for the fall, and we just spent the hour just, you know, telling him it's okay that you feel like this. This is more important. And in some ways, being authentic about it, and in some ways feeling, but I cannot understand your reality. I'm trying to honor it. I relate to it in some ways, but at the same time, I cannot. I will not pretend to understand what it is that you're feeling. And that's just been something, you know, that I'm trying to grapple with very personally. But then, what does that mean for my work? And it's an ongoing process. I don't have the answers for that, but I wanted to put that out there, and, you know, in recognition. Christina, your work has been so useful to me in helping me understand that process of racialization. You have no idea. And so thank you very much, Sharon, for this session, and for the presenters for what you're putting out there.
I don't know if it's Gian or I know Kamari was also raising her hand before, but maybe one of you can go. Okay.
Kamari, go for it. I have a lot to say, but yes, go.
Yeah, thanks, Gerardo and Blanca, especially in relation to the performativity, and I sort of keep coming back to this, you know, the imperial project of racialization has impacted, I think, all of us in multiple ways. I think even though I was in my home country, I was racialized through my schooling, in terms of really having multiple layers of myself, in terms of, you know, performing self for my family and then for my school. So but I was totally unaware of the process that was happening until I moved here. And then with those new layers of racialization, then it was this shock of understanding how all of these things are working, together. So back again to, I think, Gerardo, how do we create those spaces? Because to me, I think now that is the most important thing I can do as a scholar. Like the responsibility, because already it's deeply, deeply embedded with all of the other inequities. So this sort of the fluidity of the notion of visibility and invisibility, right? When it suits them, it's like, yes, we become the tokenized, we become the poster people. Our work becomes co-opted to actually encourage and promote internationalization in ways that the very thing that we are actually critiquing and fighting against. And then in other ways, our research, our views, and our scholarship and our experiences are totally undermined and invisibilized. And so to me, I think, how do we create that counter narrative, but how do we do it in an effective way that doesn't sort of cost us in the way that it leads to this complete, sometimes collapse of engagement. So yeah, so.
So I just want to say thank you to everybody who is bringing in this idea of like positionality and personal story with and setting it in context in sort of the larger global flows of what's going on. Specifically because I myself, as a Black person, have been dealing with this, like this, as I was talking about earlier, the psychic burden around like having to be productive and having to move forward in terms of a pandemic, while also me and people who look like me are being murdered, right? So this is something that's like deeply embedded in what I'm doing, and at the same time having to reconcile the simultaneously precarious and privileged position that I'm in as a PhD student who is paid to be hypermobile. These kinds of things are really difficult to reconcile. And so I think for me, you might have noticed like in my presentation, I'm not necessarily addressing sort of the George Floyd, the uprisings, the pandemic in a meaningful way. But I think it's definitely undergirding what kind of motivates what I'm doing. And so I want to go back to, as I think Blanca really mentioned, this gut feeling of where we are. And I think that is, again, when I talk about affect theory, what I'm trying to get at, because everybody comes with their own sort of position, and relating to it relating to kind of the larger societal things is messy. And so sitting with this discomfort around who we are, how we relate to race, and how we relate to internationalization is something that I think can be generative, but at the same time is also sort of inhibited by conversations that don't necessarily get at what it is we're actually trying to do. And so that's kind of what I meant when I started at the beginning of this panel in terms of like, how do we move forward? Like where's the theory bringing us in terms of like notions of praxis, and what does that look like really on an individual, but also meso and macro level? And so I also would like to kind of invite maybe a bit more discussion, like even one-on-one discussion with myself, or sort of disagreement, critique on actual like theoretical innovation, just because I think that like that could be for me what that might look like, but I don't know what that would look like for other people. So I'm kind of wanting to sit with this trouble, as it were.
Sue?
Yeah, I want to thank everyone. Yeah, again, I want to thank you, Sharon, for organizing this explicit thread of the conversation on race and racism, because I think it's really important to talk about that right now. And it's kind of hides underneath most of the critical internationalization. And I want to go back to Vanessa's point, really, and also reflect on some of the things that Christina's presentation really raised for me, and Kumari's as well. You know, I think it's already about bringing to the fore talking about race and why we need to talk about it, and realizing that we don't actually have tools, like really good tools to talk about it. And the difficulty is that we're in this bubble of critical internationalization that kind of does have the will to deal with it or engage with it, at least on some level. And on outside is this much bigger bubble of a different type of critical internationalization, which has weaponized the criticality that we take for granted and has a huge ability to mobilize that materially to attack bodies of people. So this is truly horrible. Yeah. So I just think that at the heart of it is something that Christina raised, which is about the othering of the bodies, and this idea, you know, particularly that Chinese people in the Canadian context, I think it's more noticeable in the American and the Canadian in North American context. You see that they're the visible invisible people, right? Because they're not Black and they're not white. And so the race cannot be seen in terms of color. And yet these are bodies that have clearly throughout history been both exploited. So that story that Christina has about the international student, and then the story that Kumari has about building the infrastructure of the nation, right? That there's the migrant bodies and the racialized bodies are labor. And the role of the racialized body is to be stigmatized so that it provides labor, and labor that's functional. So I just really think we need to think about this, and that it's not only and somehow to link the important things that Jian raises about affect and embodiedness and people's feelings to this political economy and this horrible situation of really overt and murderous racism that is without shame manifesting itself throughout not just our education, but our entire world. So I don't know, I mean, it's not a very coherent thought that I have, but I think it's around how does critical internationalization articulate and initiate a dialogue about race and racism that doesn't fall back into the categories of race and racism that can, that will be totally hostage to the tendency to weaponize, because that's what race does. That's the work that it does. That's why it exists as a structure, to weaponize race against race in order that labor can continue to be exploited, and through the operation of stigma on people's bodies. So it's very complicated.
Sarah.
I just wanted to ask a question, and if it's a question that doesn't follow on from that, in my head it follows on from this and the conversation, but if it doesn't, we can shelve it and keep focused on Sue's points. I just wanted to ask Jian if, to go back to your initial question about decentering the nation state, whether that was something you thought about at length or in any way, or if that's more a question you want to sort of front here, and whether or not that can be brought into this conversation as an element of work.
Yes, no, so definitely. I mean, this idea, the decentering of the nation state is, I mean, we talked about methodological nationalism a little bit earlier, and I think that that's a huge aspect. I wrote a book chapter that unfortunately the edited volume was scuttled, but it was around a nationality, this idea of identifying with neither here nor there kind of a thing, and using sort of gender and queer studies to kind of look at it through the lens of like folks can possibly identify as agender. Why can we not identify as anational? And this was a research stance that I wanted to adopt in my work. So when we talk about the nation as being an overarching thing, I mean, even in my presentation, it's seen as more common sense. You know, it's like this idea that nation is it's a passport, right? We all belong to a specific country. You know, boom, boom, done. But when I also think about my, again, privileged and precarious position, I think about, you know, how I fit into the American nation state in certain ways because of a blue passport, but then in other ways where I don't because I'm from a family of immigrants. And so this idea of like not belonging in terms of the nation state is really prevalent also in the concept of thinking through what it means for other places, right? So we talk about the US and the UK and Australia, kind of this Anglophone hegemon, but in Switzerland, you know, for example, this idea of nation doesn't really follow through and follow the same logic simply because of the three different ethno-linguistic groups, main ethno-linguistic groups. There's a fourth one, but it's very, very small. And so that's, yeah, it's definitely something that I want to center in my work in terms of thinking about why it's such a prevalent sort of overarching theme. But I'm curious as to what that will look like in the actual nuts and bolts of my dissertation. I'm still fleshing it out.
Tatiana, and then I know Stuart also had his hand up a while ago.
I was gonna say that I know that Stuart wanted to go before, so I just want to go after Stuart. Go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of follow up on Sarah and John's discussion around the nation state, but also come back to something, Kamari, you talked about in your presentation about the erasure of race and internationalization, which really struck with me. And I guess there's a question about what are the different ways or levels at which race is erased in internationalization, and does that happen in similar or different ways across different contexts, for example, in the UK or Canada or the US? And just to give you an example, so here in the UK, there's very literal ways in which race is erased for international students, in that, you know, a lot of the discourse and the policy around race and justice and equality in the universities is about access to the university. When you have, you know, widening access, widening participation demands to be able to access the university. And of course, all of that is completely inaccessible to international students. There is no widening access or widening participation along the lines of race or class or anything else once you go outside the nation state border, and all the you know, institutional frameworks that are set up for that exclude international students. There's also the kind of focus on issues of achievement, right? And inequalities of achievement in the university in relationship to race. And in the UK, international students are completely excluded from that. The data isn't even collected for international students. So when there's talk about measuring achievement gaps and trying to have policy to address that, it's about home students, even though there's all these international, I mean, some of our campuses are half the campus is international students. So there's very specific mechanisms in which race is erased. And I think paying attention to those is really important, and think about whether that happens in the same way or different way. The other thing kind of is linking with nation state, and also kind of the idea of embodiment, but in a kind of different sense. And that's within the nation state, when we talk about race and equality and justice, and in the university, it's always about not just who's at the university, but who's not at the university, right? So it's you know, the student body, the staff body, in relationship to the different racialized groups around the public within the nation state. Yeah. And when it comes to international students, because we don't have a kind of broader kind of sense of a broader public, it's mostly about when we're talking about race, we're talking about the experience of those international students who are here on campus, right? Not about who's not here. So we don't have a lot of discussion here at UCL about African, international students from Africa. There's just not many here, right? And most of our international students come from China and so forth. So I think thinking about embodiments and the nation state in relation to race is going to be important about the difference about when we go cross the nation state border.
Tatiana, you want to go?
Yes, it seems like Stuart proposes a whole direction for discussion, and I am conscious of the time we have. So I just have a brief kind of a question and connecting to Kumari's discussion of democratic racism. One of the ways of addressing the issue of race and internationalization, it seems, is to view it as part of a citizenship project. And the definition and whiteness. So American citizenship overlaps with whiteness, and that's it is quite evident in the present discourse. In the United States, and I give you an example. Although if you ever interested in doing discourse analysis of Trump's tweets or speeches, it's a very ungrateful task. But what is useful to notice when the COVID-19, when he persisted in calling COVID-19 as a Chinese virus, and there was criticism that pointed out that this is racist, Trump's response to that was that he does not mean that Asian Americans are responsible for the virus. And he said something to the effect that they're working along with us in combating the virus. And this is opposition between them. Asian Americans, as he said, they're tremendous people, they work along with us. And us really signifies, confirms the status of us as the whiteness, as the white citizens, and Asian Americans as not just the other, but the foreign other. So that, I think, is one of the, could be a productive line of inquiry in race and internationalization.
So this is really instructive of like what we think about when we think about discourses, right? And for me, I'm based in communication, so I'm always thinking about like a lot of my methodologies are discourse centered, that sort of thing. But I'm curious for what people are thinking about when we talk about this reluctance to name race as a overarching theme, simply because in Switzerland, what scholars have found is that there's like a nationally bound concept of race muteness. And so there's been a lot of work around how people don't it's not that people don't see, it's not race blindness as popularized in the United States, it's race muteness. And so they see, but they don't talk about. And so I'm wondering what we do when we say, okay, so this is the problem, we're not talking about it, how do we move forward? And the question that I have is, if we're using a sort of cognitive or linguistic approach to name racism as a problem, is that enough? Because what I'm seeing as in my research in terms of affect is like people are not, I mean, maybe willing to address it, maybe willing to talk about it. It sort of pops up in my data set, but it does not necessarily undo this effective investment in race, in racism, in talking through inequalities. And so I think that for me is the step where I falter. I don't know exactly how to talk about what we do when we talk about race in relation to race muteness. And so naming Trump as a racist, we know, we've been new, like we know this is a huge thing, and it doesn't seem to do any of the liberatory work that I was talking about at the beginning of the panel. I just don't, I'm really struggling with this, and so I would love to hear people's thoughts about it.
So what I'm seeing about the erasure here in Canada is particularly with the whole discourse on multiculturalism, and especially among even my researcher colleagues from, say, across BC or many of them across Canada, there's this huge, enthusiasm of doing work in intercultural communication and intercultural awareness and diversity. And so international students are useful then in order to show how diverse we are and how welcoming we are. So the, Schick and St. Denis's work of the good nation, we're the good people, we're the good white people, because we are inviting the world and because we are multicultural, how can we be racist? So you can't even enter a conversation to talk about race because all there is, it's like this pushback about, but we're culturally diverse. Look at how many languages we speak in the Lower Mainland. Look at the diversity. So whiteness then becomes, it's a problem that's raised by people of color as something, and so there's no room because then we're the unhappy migrants, right? The angry indigenous people. And so it's like we're fighting against these multiple things about the construction of nation as the unproblematic nature of the way Canada has been founded, but also then we come to this unproblematic way in which it can't be problematic because we are now very diverse and we're very multicultural.
Dale?
I really appreciate the panel as a whole, but I really appreciate that point, Kamari, about Canada. And I wanted to also suggest that I think that higher ed uses, in Canada at least, uses internationalization and international students to, as a buttress, it's definitely a buttress to define the Canadian nation as whiteness, as white. This is like Hemani Banerjee's point that the idea of the nation's always in crisis and you always have to reinforce it. And the international students are definitely used that way. But I think also institutions use them to differentiate themselves from discourses of race, or more transparently racist discourses in popular culture about international students. So like in BC, we have a lot of conversations about expensive housing, and there's a website called the University of Beautiful Cars about UBC, which frames international students as, really Christina's point about they're both ideal immigrants and the quote unquote yellow peril, and institutions and I think even our colleagues use this to buttress themselves as the good internationalizers by saying like, well, we embrace multiculturalism and these are dangerous, even when we can see that multiculturalism is a facade. It says so obviously is at so many points. We can distance ourselves because we would never complain about housing prices in the context of international students, and therefore we don't have to examine the whiteness that suffuses our institutions.
Karen?
Thanks. I'm in this really funny position where I spent a long time critiquing Canadian multiculturalism, so I hear exactly what you're saying. In some very messed up, weird way, I miss it living in the UK, as much as I think it's super problematic because, and it's a bit nerve-wracking to say this knowing this is being recorded actually, but yeah, like I'm really disoriented here because I work among a lot of colleagues who are what they would call white working class, and it becomes really difficult to talk about race. Like I find the conversations around race so entirely more difficult here than I did in Canada. Although in Canada they're highly problematic for those reasons that Dale and Kamari you are raising. But it's like I was interrupted during a talk on some sort of possibilities of decolonial pedagogy because I was told that that wasn't relevant to our white working class students, which is just ridiculous because actually the white working class students are taking it in all sorts of wonderful ways and going on to do masters in it. And, so it's interesting. It's an interesting space to see how these things work in different places, what strategies we can use, how we can try and decenter our whiteness in one way. It doesn't work, try it in another way. And this group that we've got together here today and the wider group is probably a good space to try and work out some of these things, or at least feel some community around it.
can pop in real quick. Am I supposed to raise my hand, Sharon? Is that what? It doesn't matter. Okay. I think, one thing that really strikes me is, even in our conversation a little bit, and even other conversations that are going on, especially related to race and race relations and racial injustice right now, is that, when we think about whiteness, right, is that thinking about even our roles in upholding it. And I say that as somebody who identifies as a woman of color, as an Asian American woman, somebody who was born and raised here, daughter of immigrants, all of that stuff. And, although a lot of times I want to completely separate myself from whiteness, right? That like, oh, that's not me. White people need to get their people. But what I realized, right, of course, is that, man, I'm just as complicit in all of this, right? I'm just as guilty of upholding whiteness and white structures. And some of it honestly is probably based in, my upbringing. Some of it is also based in my position, as a faculty member within a higher ed institution and everything like that. And I think that's something that we also need to kind of reconcile, that, that we can't fix this. And honestly, I don't even know if it can be fixed, right? Because there's centuries of history with all of this and everything. But what I find is that, even talking to my friends, and especially my friends of color, is that, look, we can't say like white people need to go fix this, because white people can't completely fix all of this, because we're just as guilty, right? We're just as complicit. We are also a part of this and everything. I think also when thinking about what is race, right? I think it's so contextual. It's so contextual, and that sometimes some of these words have lost their meaning. Is that I think even like I have a niece and nephew, they're 13 years old, and when they hear somebody say something like kind of discriminatory or whatever, their automatic response is, that's racist. That's racist. And I've asked them, we're like, what does that mean? And they're like, well, that means it's, mean and based on what somebody looks like or whatever. I'm like, well, and I had to kind of stop myself from going like super deep into all of it and everything. But I think the word race has lost some of the meaning, right? Racism has lost some of the real true meaning of it. Thinking about how much with these statements that universities are putting out is that it's always about, we're being inclusive, we're committed to diversity. What does that even mean? That doesn't help the situation, right? Of Black people dying and everything. And so, yeah, I mean, I think even with thinking about how, to a certain extent, language has become very diluted. So there's a real fear of these words, but yet at the same time, they become so watered down that that we can use it a little bit more and everything. So I don't know. It's just a little bit of that what's going on in my head.
The things that Christina and Karen were just saying, and then what many other people have said, either in the chat or by speaking, makes me think about the complications that international students are walking into when they leave their home context and then jump into the US, the UK, wherever it is, Canada, and how much learning has to happen from the second they step foot off the plane. I mean, obviously it depends on their past experiences and where they're coming from, but how much learning there is for students of color and for white students as international students about where they are right now, if they've moved to the US, for example, to study there. And how so many of us are learning every day more things about the intricacies of race and racism and how it is interwoven throughout, for example, the US society. And how we have so many students who are coming into that who might be racialized when they set foot on the ground, and are trying to navigate that in addition to being, young learners and being college students and those sorts of things. So it's just the complexity of what we're seeing as scholars or as graduate students ourselves, maybe having lived in these places for a long time, compounded by students who are brand new and having to do so much learning about the new racial world that they've become a part of.
You know what, Max? And this is the international student in me speaking, because that makes so much sense to me. There's also the unlearning that you have to do, reflecting back on where you come from. Like I come from the equivalent of the white construct in Mexico, you know, and Christina mentioned colorism. I benefited from that tremendously. But it wasn't until I got to Canada that I started seeing that, until I was racialized differently. And then coming to Arizona, of all places, you know, it's the work of a lifetime in some ways. And that to me is one of the complications between an internationalization when you're talking about students. Maybe international students have a bit more time to process some of these things, but study abroad, you know, the more and more I live this, the more conflicted I feel about it, even though I want to hold on to the notion that of intercultural, you know, competence, and so those are the things that, you know, I'm also trying to grapple with, like what do 2 weeks in, you know, you went to Rome as part of our study abroad program, in the master's program. What did 2 weeks in Rome teach you about? I don't know anything. I don't want to say that your master's degree didn't count for anything, but you know what I mean? 2 weeks, you know, I don't know.
So I noticed we are sort of at our time, but I also sense there's a lot of interest in diving deeper on this topic. So I'm thinking, I mean, I have to think also long-term and welcome all of your feedback about how we can continue the conversations that are contained within these few sessions in a more substantive way. And a lot of the broad network is a kind of, it's a very big tent. And not necessarily everyone is interested in diving in this level of depth, but I think within the network framework, we can maybe find spaces for these different streams of conversation in addition to infiltrating, you know, the mainstream conversation as well. So I will think about how we can do that and welcome your feedback. And as I mentioned in my comment on the side, I think this conversation especially has reminded me that we also need to talk about the pedagogy of critical internationalization studies. There's a lot of, for us, especially as scholars, focus on the research, but given that we know that it's not only an informational problem about just having this research there, it is available and it has been for a long time. So what else, what other kind of pedagogical interventions that are also maybe embodied and affective and relational might we need in order to keep this moving while we continue the important work of the research? So that may also be another place for a long-term conversation and maybe collaboration on some kind of resources. So I guess this is the end of the conference. It's gone by very fast. It's been very lovely. Thank you everyone, especially our presenters for this session. And thank you, Dale, also for your assistance making this happen. And I will be in touch with further information, and please feel free to be in touch with me as well if you have ideas of how we can keep the momentum going and keep deepening these conversations.
And real quick, I know, Sharon, you're recording this, but there's a lot of really great stuff in the chat, so I felt myself going back and forth, and it's great. Y'all know y'all can download the chat, so you can save it. Do y'all know how to, does everybody know this? People may be more fluent in Zoom than I am. But if you open the chat box, I think there's the little, at the bottom where you can actually type stuff in, there's a little 3 bubbles, and you can click on it, and it says save chat. And it downloads it directly into your hard drive, I think, which is great because there's a lot of great resources and a lot of great conversations, especially if we want to follow up with each other. That might be a great way to do it too. So
thank you so much, Christina. I had no idea.
I just learned this about 2 weeks ago, and I was like, wow. So
great. Anyone else have a last word or last piece of wisdom they want to share?
Just thank you so much. Thanks everybody who contributed.
Thank you so much, everybody, really.
Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Ready.
Thank you.
Bye.